Okay, thank you, Provost Paul. It's now with excitement and deepest appreciation that I get to introduce our 2014 keynote speaker, Dr. Paul Gorski. Dr. Gorski is an associate professor in New Century College and a research fellow in the Center for Advancement of Wellbeing at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And it's my alma mater, so I'll say, go Patriots. He is an accomplished scholar. He's a social justice activist, and he's just a wonderful human being. Right? I got to have dinner with him last night, and he's just such a good soul. We're lucky. And he founded EdChange, which is a great site which you guys will have. It's actually part of your resource packets. But EdChange, there's lots of good ideas, resources that you can tap into that address social equity issues, right? And so that's something that I definitely would like you guys to check out. And he lives in the Washington, D.C. area, and Dr. Gorski lives with 2 cats, Unity and Buster. And so I would like you to help me give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. Paul Gorski. Move my stuff out of your way.
Good morning, everybody. Let's see. I think we just need to pull up the PowerPoint.
Magic.
Ta-da! Okay. All right. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks again to the committee who pulled this together. If any of you haven't ever been on a committee that worked on an event like this, I have been on many such committees and know how hard it is, how much work it is. So thank you. And I'm very honored to be the first keynote speaker of this brand new conference that I'm sure is going to be around for many years to come, although that does put a little pressure on me to say something important and smart. Let's see if I can. You all got a copy of my book. It's in your packet. And I want to tell you the most exciting part of that book is actually that I dedicated it to my grandmother, who I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But my grandmother, my mom's side of the family comes from poor Appalachian coal mining stock. I mean, they weren't always coal miners, actually. They became coal miners because industry came into a part of the country where previous to that, nobody thought there was anything valuable, and literally destroyed their neighborhoods. Coal companies, lumber companies, timber companies came in. And what ended up happening was this place where people had been subsistence farmers, they ended up with a couple of choices. One choice was go into the military. And they knew if they went into the military as poor people, they were going to be sent straight to the front lines. That's what happens to poor people in the military, particularly poor people of color. Their second option was to work in an industry that was destroying their community, literally destroying the waterways, destroying the farmland, tearing people apart. And those are the kinds of options that poor people in our country have. And so what I want to talk to you about today, the title of this is really the title of the book, because I'm so horrible at coming up with titles to things. But what I really want to talk to you today is about the most important shift in understanding. And it really comes down to this. If I believe that poor people are poor because of their own deficiencies, if I believe that the economic achievement gap exists because there's something wrong with poor people, I cannot be an effective teacher for low-income students. That is the bottom line, period. And the biggest struggle we have today, unfortunately, around issues of poverty and education is that many of the most popular models for preparing teachers to teach with low-income students are basically teaching teacher stereotypes about poor people. And that's the shift we have to make. We have to insist on that shift of ourselves and of other people. And so I want to start with just as an initial reflection. Thinking about this, why are poor people poor in the United States? And why are wealthy people wealthy? Now, there's the traditional narrative about why poor people are poor and why wealthy people are wealthy. That generally goes something like this. Wealthy people worked hard. U.S. is a meritocracy, so people get back what they put in to their work. The flip side of that, the danger of that narrative, other than the fact that it simply isn't true, is the flip side, dangerous part of that narrative is that people who didn't make it just didn't work hard enough. Now remember, I have family who came out of the coal mines. This is my grandmother. And as much as I would love to spend the next hour just looking at her in this beautiful photo, she is cute, isn't she? Yes. This is how I know that poor people aren't the problem. So when I grew up hearing these stereotypes, poor people don't care about education. Grandma was the valedictorian in her school. Poor people are bad parents. Poor people are violent. I spent a lot of my summers in Appalachia among some of the poorest people in the entire country. I never, in that context, saw someone raise a hand at somebody else. In that context, what I saw was poor people don't start wars, you know. So when we think about who's violent, when we think about how we've been socialized to think about people, right, we have to actively think. We have to actively push ourselves to look through a different window. My grandmother, like I said, was a valedictorian of her graduating class in high school. The year she turned 50, my grandmother started nursing school. She hadn't been to college previous to that, but she had raised 6 kids. She started nursing school, finished nursing school the same year I finished my bachelor's degree. And the same year my mother finished her associate's degree. We just timed things very well in my family. But this is how I learned that the poor are not the problem. The biggest barrier that we have to overcome is people who care about this. And I start with the assumption, this is why I love to work with teachers. I have friends who go out and do these workshops about race and class and diversity in the corporate sector and the government sector. I'm like, no, I'm going to work with teachers. And this is why I love working with teachers. There is not an educator in this room who doesn't want all of their students to succeed. I really believe that. I mean, is there anyone in here who went into teaching for the pay? I don't. Raise your hand. Yes. Somebody misinformed you. I'm sorry. Is there anybody who went into teaching because of the respect we get in society? No, we go into education because we care, because we deeply care about the lives of youth. That's why we go into education. That's why I love to work with educators. But here's the other thing, because I often hear teachers in every other way being well-intended talking about the economic achievement gap and blaming parents, blaming low-income parents. Those people don't care about education. Those people don't care about education. Again, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but first, just recognizing that's not true. Just as there's nobody in this room who doesn't want the best for all of your students, there is not a parent in your community who does not want the best for their kids. So if you believe that, and let me tell you this as well, if I believe as an educator that poor people are poor because of deficient parenting and deficient families who don't care about education, one thing that I have to remember is who is the rest of society blaming for the economic achievement gap? Teachers, that's right. So the deficit view that teachers can't work this miracle, which is take people who have been the victims of economic inequalities their entire lives and somehow transform that in a semester or in a school year. I have to recognize what I'm doing when I pass that deficit view back down to the parents. And that's the root of it. And that's why when I go into schools and I talk about this, I say, I know what we want. What many of us want is just give me the 10 easy steps to helping all low-income people achieve. And we have to recognize that doesn't exist, and none of those models work around anything. I also see those like, here are the 5 things you need to know about how African Americans learn. And I'm like, really? All we need to know is that someone's ancestors came, well, all of our ancestors came from Africa, but that all I need to know is that somebody's ancestors come from somewhere on this continent, and I can just assume they all learn the same way, and they're all the same people. Well, it's the same thing with low-income people. So challenging those assumptions, and that really is what this presentation is going to be about. And so just as I know that poor people aren't the problem, I know that teachers can be part of the solution, because this is Mr. Hill, my 7th and 8th grade chorus teacher, an incredible man, an incredible, the singing didn't really stick with me. I mean, in that sense, he failed miserably, but in all other ways, and I don't know if you can see this, but if you look really closely, I just showed this picture at a keynote. There's someone doing a little, what do you call that? A little photo bomb between us there. Anyway, but that's Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill more or less saved my life as a working class kid in school. He's the person who made me want to be an educator, Mr. Hill. He's the one who challenged the stereotypes, who took on his colleagues when they were, what just happened? Who took on his colleagues when they were contributing to the stereotypes, who never allowed a negative word to be spoken about poor or working class people. He's the person who made me want to be a social justice educator and an educator in general. But again, it's also what gives me hope about the future of this, because I think most teachers are like Mr. Hill. I think most of us desperately want all of our students to succeed. So then, in order to achieve that, what we need, I think sometimes what we think we need are just some practical strategies. Just give me some strategies. My experience, and I've worked with hundreds of schools all over the world around this stuff, my experience is that it's even harder than that. The issue is not mostly a practical issue. It's mostly an ideological issue. 90% an ideological shift. 90% about what we believe, because what we believe drives what we do. And that's what I learned from Mr. Hill. We'll talk more about that in a second. So just to get a little sense of what we believe, and also because there's so many public school people here, and as you all know, we can't really have, apparently we're not allowed to have a meaningful educational experience without some sort of standardized multiple choice assessment. So I have this little quiz for us, so let's see how you all do. A Princeton study of elite universities found that legacy applicants, people usually white and wealthy, with a parent or grandparent who attended the institution, are far more privileged by legacy status than applicants of color are by affirmative action policies. The study determined that legacy status was equivalent to how much of a boost to an applicant's SAT score? How many of you would guess a 20-point boost? 90-point boost. 160-point boost. You are very cynical, and you are correct. 160-point boost. It's funny how people celebrate that. Yes, I got it right. The world is unjust, but at least I got the question right. So translation of this, when you think about things like welfare programs, and you think about the meager little slices of pie that are made available to low-income people, and the thing you think in your mind is, well, why are there special handouts for some people? There have always been special handouts for wealthy people and for white people in this society, always, and there still are, and that's exactly what this is. That's exactly what this is. This is affirmative action for wealthy white people. So that's the shift of consciousness, because we're not socialized to think about it in those terms. We're not socialized to think that if Google paid its taxes, Google, one of the wealthiest corporations in the world, hasn't paid taxes in years. One of my friends calculated that if Google paid its taxes, Google's taxes could pay for the entire food stamps program in the country. But we're trained always to look down the power continuum. Those poor people are sucking off the system instead of looking up and saying, those wealthy people are sucking off the system. Even though the ways that wealthy people are sucking off the system is costing us as taxpayers factors of thousands more than welfare programs are. But that's a consciousness thing. That's an ideological thing. And I have to work to shift my understanding of that. A majority of poor people in the U.S. live in, how many of you would say urban areas? Suburban areas? Rural areas? Rural areas is the correct answer, although the fastest growing percentage of poor people are suburban areas now. I always think I'm going to take this question out because I can't say the word rural. 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 Am I the only one who can't say rural? I don't know. I feel foolish up here. Who is more likely to be addicted to drugs and alcohol? How many of you would say poor people? Middle-class people? Wealthy people? It's not even close. But who does the stereotype stick to? Who does the stereotype? Yeah, they can't afford it, yeah. But this also points to another reality. Whenever there is an oppression in these sets of stereotypes, it hurts all of us. Because what happens is this stereotype even hurts wealthy kids. Because the assumption is they don't have these issues at home. Well, I'll tell you what, wealthy kids are just as likely to be beaten at home. They're just as likely to be addicted to drugs, or just as likely, actually more likely to be addicted to drugs. They're just as likely to experience violence in their homes and that sort of thing. So even when we have these stereotypes about poor people, it hurts all people. The 3 richest people in the world have as much wealth as, how many of you think it's the 8 poorest people in the world? The 8 poorest countries in the world. The 48 poorest countries in the world. The 308 poorest countries in the world. Right? Some of you have just stopped playing, I've noticed. All right, who said the 308 poorest countries? Correct answer is the 48 poorest countries. And for those of you who chose the 308 poorest countries, I hope you're not geography teachers, because there are not 308 countries. Oh, man. All right. There's no particular reason why you would know any of those statistics, but I think it is important for us to think about how we've been misinformed. Because again, I'll talk more about this in a second. I think this notion that the U.S. is this egalitarian country and everyone has equal opportunity. I mean, just think about this for a second. We call school the great equalizer, right? How many people have heard that notion? School is a great equalizer. Think about the difference between the schools that the wealthiest kids go to and the poorest kids go to. And now just look at that by itself and then ask yourself, how could I be so suckered into thinking education, we call education the great equalizer, and then we send the wealthiest kids to these schools that have 10 kids in a class, that have like 4-to-1 student-to-teacher ratios, that have billion-dollar endowments, and all of these sorts of things, right? And so again, rethinking the reality versus what we're socialized to think. So I have these starting assumptions. One is that poor people bear the brunt of almost every imaginable social ill in the U.S. I mean, of course, there are things that hurt all of us. The rising costs of college tuition, all of these sorts of things. But poor people bear the brunt of most of it, including, and this is why the kind of congruence that you heard about in terms of thinking about, for instance, the food we're eating, the clothes we're wearing. That's why this congruence is so important. That even though a lot of these things affect all of us, they affect poor people the hardest, particularly poor people of color, particularly poor people of indigenous backgrounds all over the world. Inequities in our schools. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm missing one of the starting assumptions, so number 2 makes no sense at all. Number 2 is supposed to be that all people deserve access to some basic human rights, one of those being access to the best possible education that we could provide them. And then number 3 is that inequities in our society and in our schools mean that all people don't have this access. But these last 2 points, I think, are equally important. I know that I'm talking about some big contextual stuff so far. My argument is not that it's every 3rd grade teacher's responsibility to eliminate global poverty. I mean, as individual citizens, I think it is our responsibility to do that. But as educators, as teachers, as my role in the schools, that might feel like it's a little bit outside my sphere of influence. But it is my responsibility to create an equitable learning environment. In other words, to make sure that I'm not replicating those inequalities in my work as an educator. And just going back to that school as a great equalizer thing, nationally, if you compare the schools that the wealthiest kids go to and the lowest income kids go to, and just talking about public schools here, so we're not even talking about elite private schools. These are some of the differences between those schools that we're calling the great equalizer, right? So again, how do I shift my ideology to understand what's really going on? I could make a better argument that the reason that what public schools do is actually recreate the inequality that already exists in the country, that's sort of what, that's sort of what they do. That argument by the data that exists is actually easier to make than the argument that schools are created to be the great equalizer. We have to recognize that and work to change that, and there's more. And then people think that I make this stuff up, so I just throw a few references in there, not making it up. So again, this is the most practical note. I know for some of us, you want to say, okay, just tell me what I could do in my classroom. But this to me is the most practical note of the whole thing. If we start with the belief that poor people are poor because poor people are deficient, now, first of all, if we're going to do that, we have to ignore all of this. We just have to pretend it doesn't exist. And that's why some of these frameworks we use for learning about this stuff, like the culture of poverty framework and those sorts of things, that actually pretend this doesn't exist. That's why those are doing a tremendous amount of damage in our schools right now. Some of the most popular frameworks for talking about this are doing tremendous amounts of damage because they forget to mention stuff like this. So it becomes about what do we fix about poor people. If we start with that belief, we have already lost this game. If we start with that belief, the most practical thing any of us can do is let go of the stereotypes. And if we're not willing to let go of the stereotypes, none of the practical strategies anybody can discuss is going to be helpful to us. I mean, you think about and this is about class, but you can also think about this across race. I can have 10 strategies for engaging African American and Latino youth, but if I walk into my classroom as a racist, those strategies are not going to help me. It's the same thing about class and poverty. Same thing about class and poverty. If I walk into the classroom having these deficit views of poor people, it does not matter what strategies I use. It does not matter what strategies I use, and that's why that's the most practical tool, is letting go of those stereotypes. So what are some of those stereotypes? So just think for a second about some of the popular stereotypes that you've heard, maybe in the media, maybe in the teacher's lounge, wherever, stereotypes that you've heard about poor people. And think about this, laziness. How many of you have heard the notion that poor people are lazy? You familiar with that stereotype? You don't want to raise your hands because you think that means you believe the stereotype. I just mean you've heard the stereotype somewhere. Most of our low-income students have at least one parent who works. In fact, on average, poor working adults work more hours per week than wealthier adults. Why? Make less money, trying to get by, that sort of thing. How many of you have ever worked a wage job, paid by the hour? Most of us have done that, right? What happens when you're working a wage job and you want to take a couple hours off so that you can visit your kid's school? Those are the kinds of, right, you don't get paid. Those are the kinds of realities that we have to recognize. Now, if I am somebody who has a full-time job where I get paid leave, and I have, then it might be hard for me to understand, even if I had that experience previously in my life. But when we think about things like, why don't some of those parents show up for this or that? It has nothing to do with how much they care about education. It has to do with things like, I don't have paid leave. I have to decide. Imagine this being your life. I have to decide whether I'm going to go visit my kid's school. And I know what the assumptions are going to be about me and my kids if I don't visit the school. I have to decide between that and being able to afford to put dinner on the table, because I'm not going to get paid if I take those couple hours off, right? Those are the realities that we have to recognize. But there's no evidence. There's no evidence that poor people are lazier than wealthy people. There's no evidence that my grandma is lazier than Paris Hilton, that sort of thing. I mean, I would put I'm not a betting person, but on that, I would put money. I shouldn't pick on Paris Hilton. Yes, I should. Yes. I don't know. Okay. There's this notion that poor people don't value education. How many of you have ever thought that yourself, or heard a colleague say, poor people don't value education? I mean, there have been studies going back to the 70s. We've known forever that that's not true. That's purely stereotype. There's no basis, in fact, for poor people don't value education. It just doesn't exist. That reality. I mean, of course, there are people in every economic bracket who don't want to invest in their kids' education. There are people, if I'm a wealthy person, I send my kid to St. Paul's school and I don't have to deal with them at all. I just send them to a boarding school somewhere. If I'm a poor person, maybe it means I don't show up. But that notion that on average poor people care less about education, there's never been any evidence of that being true. We talked about substance abuse. Both drug and alcohol abuse are far more prevalent in wealthy communities than there are in poor communities. Crime and violence, poor people, and this is why I always feel bad because I use my dad for a lot of examples. I feel bad picking on my dad, but he gives me these great examples. So we were talking about where to send my niece to kindergarten, and I was advocating for the public schools, and he was like, well, aren't you worried about the crime and the drugs in the public schools? And so my dad was going on this whole thing about poor people and crime, and I was like, Dad, you remember that time for like 20 years when we had that cable descrambler, and we were streaming? And I was like, remember how awesome it is that somehow you hooked it up and we even got all the pay-per-view for free? Yeah. It's like, maybe I should be worried right now about the crime. Poor people do not commit more crime than wealthy people. Of course, they on average commit different kinds of crime. Wealthy people don't rob convenience stores. Poor people don't bilk their own employees out of millions of dollars in life savings. Right? Poor people don't tend to commit the kinds of crime people commit sitting at a computer. Right? That sort of thing. And as a matter of fact, white-collar crime on average does a lot more damage, including violent damage, because it does things like take people's life savings away, take people's health care away, and those sorts of things. I mean, I even think about this across race. I was always really confused about how Marion Jones, y'all remember Marion Jones, the Olympic sprinter, and then she was a basketball player and everything. So this African-American woman, went to jail because she lied under oath about her own use of steroids. How many cigarette company executives lied under oath for decades about the research their own companies had done about the effects of nicotine? And somehow we see Marion Jones as a danger to society, and not these companies that literally have murdered millions of people by lying about the effects of their products, under oath, lying about the effects of their products. So again, thinking about who is really violent in our society. And just thinking about the nature of stereotype, because this is part of how this happens. There's this psychosocial research that talks about how we tend to think of people within our own identity groups as being extraordinarily diverse. And that's why you'll hear like a white person say, well, don't lump me in with all those other white people kind of thing, right? That sort of thing. Like, I'm not the same as all other middle-class people, or I'm not like all other men, so don't let me in. But we tend to think about people in other groups as being pretty much all the same. And we actually look for evidence to confirm our stereotypes. There's my dad again. 2 consecutive slides, poor guy. Anybody here have road rage issues? Yeah. That's right. So the photographer's happy about it. The photographer's like, hell yeah, I have road rage issues. Try me, I dare you. So my dad has these road rage issues, and so, if a male driver cuts off my dad, his word of choice is jackass, jackass. If a woman driver cuts off my dad, he responds differently. It's women drivers, women drivers. Now, my dad would not be like male drivers, because then he's implicating himself. Then he's like associating with the jackasses there, right? So he's not going to do that. Right? But he'll look for evidence. And here's the thing. Every woman who drives by him who does not ignite his road rage is completely invisible to him. Completely invisible. But the one who does something becomes evidence for everyone else. And that's why I always hear this at schools all the time. People will say, well, what about that kid who came in with the expensive Air Jordans? I don't know. I use Air Jordans as an example because I'm old. And when I was in high school, it was Air Jordan. What about that one kid who came in with a starter jacket? That's the other thing I remember from school, the starter jacket. And this somehow becomes justification. This somehow becomes justification for a prejudice against all poor people. I mean, y'all don't know where they got the Air Jordans. They could be hand-me-downs. They could have come from a secondhand store. They could have been a gift. We don't know where they came from, right? But that notion that I think about it today myself, walking through D.C., and I see, I still have these tapes playing in my head. And I might pass a homeless person who's got a bottle in a brown paper bag, and sometimes my initial thought is, aha, and you're going to ask me for money? Now, if poor people just stopped drinking, maybe you wouldn't be homeless to begin with. Those are the initial tapes, because that's how I was socialized, to believe that. In D.C., it's likely I walked by 25 homeless people who were completely invisible to me, right? Because as someone who's not homeless, I can just pretend homeless people don't exist. I mean, that's one of the dirty secrets of our society right now. I could just pretend they don't exist. But as soon as I see one that confirms my stereotype, then all of a sudden there are like lights flashing around them, and I see them very clearly, right? So that's the kind of thing we have to push back against in our own psyche. Okay, so thinking again about thinking a little bit more about our psyche. Usually, when I work with schools that are talking about this issue, poverty, homelessness, those sorts of things, they're usually doing it through one of three popular views or ideologies. The first one is deficit ideology. I'm going to talk about each of these really briefly. Deficit ideology, grid ideology, structural ideology. Deficit ideology is believing that outcome inequalities are caused by moral, intellectual, and cultural deficiencies in low-income communities and individuals. So that's kind of what I've been talking about. So why does the economic achievement gap exist? Poor people don't care about education and that sort of thing. The reason why this is so important is because this informs all the practical stuff. So if I'm in a school and I've been studying that whole culture of poverty notion, and I think, oh, poor people are poor because of their cultures, and we got to do something about their cultures, then when I think about things like the economic achievement gap, my strategy might be something like, well, we have to convince low-income people to care more about education. And so I might even think that through I might have positive intentions, but the impact of that is going to be alienating low-income parents who already care about education. The problem's got nothing to do with that. But that's the problem of that deficit view. It's about fixing marginalized people rather than fixing the things that marginalize people. And that gets us way off. That's how we actually contribute to the marginalization, is by doing that. And that often is filtered through this notion of the culture or mindset of poverty. The grit view, which is sort of becoming the popular view now, is what we need to do is just help marginalized people become more resilient. We just need to cultivate grit in poor people. This comes out of the work of the guy who popularized this, writes for the New York Times and wrote a book about grit, and it's becoming a little more popular. So the idea here is, rather than dealing with the inequalities that exist, what we do is we give marginalized people grit so they can overcome the inequalities that shouldn't even be there to begin with. All right, so we got to be careful about this. There's a lot of kind of energy around this grit notion. And yes, of course, it's good for all kids to have grit so they can overcome this or that thing. But seriously, who in this society has more grit than poor people and homeless people? I mean, just showing up for school every day is a demonstration of grit for people who don't have good health insurance, for people who don't have access to nutritious food, and all of these other things. And again, the grit notion ignores, it actually acknowledges that the inequalities exist, but rather than addressing the inequalities, it just says, how can we help people overcome the inequalities, which just allows the inequalities to stay in place. What we want to do is go try to get ourselves to a more structural view. So in this view, we recognize that people in poverty have much to overcome. And so what we want to do is eliminate those barriers, because our low-income students who are given the promise of equal educational opportunity should not have to overcome a bunch of barriers to have access to something that we as a society claim is a human right. They shouldn't have to overcome those barriers. So the structural view is recognizing those barriers instead of blaming poor people, saying, how can we remove these barriers? How can we create a more equitable approach? And I give this example of family involvement. Because again, I think a lot of times the tendency is, I mean, we know this for a fact. Here is an indisputable fact right now. Low-income parents show up at lower frequencies for school-based opportunities for family involvement than their wealthier peers. That is a fact. Nationally, that's a fact that's been measured in a million ways. We know that to be the truth. The goal for us now is to reflect, how do we interpret that reality? How do I make sense of that reality? And that's much more difficult work, because I can say that exists because poor people don't care about education. I could go against every bit of evidence we have and believe that that's the easy way out, and a lot of people believe that, and I know there are people in this room who believe that despite me begging you not to believe it. Or I could take a step back. Marilyn Fry uses this example. I think, no, maybe that wasn't Marilyn Fry. I can't remember who it was. He used the example of the bird cage. And if you have your nose right up against the bird cage, you can't see all the barriers, all those little bars, and you think, well, why doesn't that bird just fly away? I don't get it. Right? And that's what that deficit view causes us to do. We miss all those bars. What we need to do is learn to take a couple steps back and ask a different question. We might ask, for instance, what are the ways in which we create opportunities for family involvement? And are we even thinking about the realities of low-income families when we do that? Are we thinking about people who are more likely to work multiple jobs, including evening jobs? Are we thinking about families who can't afford childcare and don't have transportation? Are we thinking about families who are more likely themselves to have experienced school as a hostile environment? Are we thinking about that? Is that who we're thinking about when we're planning these events? I was actually doing more of a workshop-y type thing in Reno, and I was sitting with a group of teachers who was talking about this sort of thing, and they were talking about two different parents. One was a woman, single mother, who has a wealthier background. And she travels around the world and does work. And they were talking about what a dedicated mother. Look how she sacrifices doing all this travel so that she can provide for her family. And they were talking about her missing these back-to-school nights and that sort of thing. It's like, but what a good example she's setting for her kids. And like 5 minutes later, someone else was talking about a parent, a low-income single mother, who also was missing those events. But the conversation was completely different. They were using her as evidence that she doesn't care about education, even though she was missing the events for the same reason, because she was working. So it's about taking a step back and looking at it through a different set of lenses. And in order to help that, we could think about, and I talk about all this in more detail in that groovy little book you got in your folder. Which, again, the most important part of that book is my grandmother's picture. So I better not see any of those on eBay. If you're If you're going to sell it on eBay, you better have cut out the photo of my grandma first. Don't disrespect grandma. But understanding the challenges of low-income families. And again, one of the reasons why this is so challenging is we talk about some of these challenges. And you might think to yourself, well, yeah, that's terrible, but I don't really feel as a teacher or school administrator that's within my sphere of influence. And I understand that. Again, I'm not saying all of you have to spend the rest of your lives fighting for living wages, but just think about this. Think about the living wage thing. I mean, I know some of you, for political reasons or whatever, some of you have been socialized to think that sounds like socialism or whatever it is, and people should just work harder or whatever. Think about your students. How much of a difference would it make if every one of your students had parents who had one living wage job, one living wage job, so they could work one full-time job and provide for their families? How much of a difference would that make to your kids? I mean, the problem in the U.S., we think about equal opportunity. There aren't enough living wage jobs for every working adult to have a living wage job. So if you're one of these people who thinks, well, just get a better job. There aren't enough living wage jobs in this country for every working adult to have a living wage job. It doesn't exist. And that's why poverty persists. Not because poor people don't want better paying jobs, but because they just don't exist. And as we've recovered from the economic recession, I could do a whole analysis of that, but I'll spare you. As we recover from this economic recession, through which all of the major corporations in the U.S. made record profits. But again, I won't do my analysis there. The job recovery that has happened disproportionately, the new jobs are minimum wage jobs, or jobs that are below a living wage. All right, so it just doesn't exist. So just thinking about some of the other things, preschool, who has access to preschool? The U.S. is the only industrialized country in the world that does not have universal access to preschool and kindergarten. Only the country that's most able to afford it. And now we actually have these doofus politicians. These are the same people who argue that climate change isn't real. These are the same people who argued before that nicotine isn't addictive. Same people, same group of people can be tracked back to the same funding sources. We're actually saying that preschool and kindergarten aren't good for kids. I mean, it's ridiculous. That discourse is out in the country. If you ever want to read about that, there's this book called Merchants of Doubt, and it talks about people who are basically paid to create the illusion of a debate under the guise of science where no debate actually exists. So the same people who are saying nicotine isn't a problem, who are paid by the cigarette companies, are the same people now who are paid by the Koch brothers to say that climate change, to create the illusion of a debate about climate change when there really is no debate. And now they're in the education business. They're the ones who are arguing that class size doesn't matter, that preschool and kindergarten don't matter, and those sorts of things. Pollution. Where does our government tend to put toxic waste sites? In communities where people have the least access to health care, right? So those high rates of things like asthma in low-income communities, those sorts of things. Neighborhood factors, low-quality social, municipal, and local services. Again, you might look at these and say, that is outside my purview. But that is the reality for your low-income student. That is their reality for your low-income students, for your homeless students. They're living that reality. And as a result of that, we want to make sure we aren't piling on. Because often what happens is we blame them for the impact of that reality. Well, they don't care about education. They should just work harder. Any of us who lived that reality would not be able to do our best in school. Not one person in here would be able to do that. And then, of course, the end school stuff. We talked about that earlier. Also think about safe and affordable housing, affirming society. Low-income students are bullied. We have this whole bully discourse in the U.S. I don't think we have to talk about it around class, recreational opportunity. And again, part of the problem with that culture of poverty or mindset of poverty argument is that it pretends that stuff doesn't exist. I mean, God, I swore to myself I wouldn't do this, but I have to do this. I remember the first time I read Ruby Payne. First of all, I thought that was satire. I thought there's no way somebody reads this and thinks, that sounds about right. But there's a lot of problems with that framework. The problems are with the culture of poverty framework that she uses. But the part of the big problem is it's completely silent on this. There's nothing in there that talks about poor people don't have access to health care. That seems pretty important. Poor people don't have access to kindergarten and preschool. That seems pretty important. So we have to move away from these models that pretend these bigger inequalities don't exist. And we have to just put ourselves in the models that acknowledge the inequalities so that we can respond to them and not think that we can fix this by fixing poor people or understanding this vague notion that all poor people have the same culture, because they don't. So again, I guess the bottom line here is that access to advantaged institutions, whether they are schools or places that pay a living wage or whatever, may explain why children in comparatively advantaged neighborhoods tended to have higher vocabulary and reading scores. So in other words, the people who are out there researching this, who are measuring this, is very clear. None of them are, I mean, the culture of poverty model was debunked in the 1960s. Right? So somehow 50 years later, it's still the dominant view in education. But the people who are actually doing the research about why this stuff exists, none of them use that model because they know it's ridiculous to think that my poor, white, Appalachian, Presbyterian grandma has anything culturally in common with a poor Somali Muslim refugee who's been in the, I mean, think about those two people and ask yourself, what do they have in common culturally? What value is it to learn about a culture of poverty when they have nothing? Here's what those two people have in common: a lack of access to health care, a lack of access to kindergarten and preschool, a lack of access to living wage work. That's what they have in common. What they have in common is a lack of access to schools and other social institutions where they don't experience bias and prejudice. That's what they have in common. And so that's what our target should be. So I like to take, instead of a culture of poverty view, I like to take an equity literacy view, where we put the notion of equity at the center of the conversation rather than the notion of culture at the center of the conversation. And so some principles to think about. One, I just mentioned poor people are diverse. They do not share a culture. If you are spending any of your time addressing this by trying to learn about a culture of poverty, I mean, as I say, I mean, people are getting really wealthy off of these models. The culture of poverty, the African-American learning style, you know, the Asian American learning style. I mean, just picture Asia in your mind. That is a huge frickin' continent. I mean, can we assume because two people come from that, their ancestors come from somewhere on that continent, that they have anything at all in common other than their ancestors having come from that continent? Same thing about poor people. Poor Appalachian people in central Appalachia, where my grandma came from, are not the same as poor urban African-American people. What I've been saying, what we believe about people in poverty, including our biases and prejudice, informs how we teach and relate to people in poverty. So again, there's no way to do this if we're not willing to take on our own stereotypes. So I want to talk about, because I know some of you are waiting patiently for the practical strategies. So we've gotten to that point here. So part of what I did in my book is I looked at about the last 30 years of research. Well, what I found basically was if we took the kind of education that the wealthiest kids in this country are getting, and we gave access to low-income kids to that same education, that they would do a lot better. It wouldn't completely eliminate the economic achievement gap because we still have problems like lack of health care and that sort of thing. But it would make a big dent. Unfortunately, what we're doing, because we've all lost our minds with this high-stakes testing stuff, is that we are more and more taking away that kind of education from our lowest income students, which is completely illogical. Completely illogical. And it's really the mark of a sociopathic society when it comes to issues like poverty. We pretend we want to address the economic achievement gap, and then we take our lowest income students and we take away all of the things that have proven to help address the economic achievement gap. One of those things is incorporating music and art, that sort of thing. We know that every student but especially low-income students do better in every subject area when they have access to the arts. Of course, in a lot of yes. Hooray for the arts. One of the, and of course, in a lot of places what's happening is that the arts are the first thing to go if kids aren't meeting, if the test scores aren't meeting annual or yearly progress. Right, we take away, and this is especially devastating for low-income kids whose parents are less likely. It's not that they don't value the arts. This is the important distinction. It's that they're less likely to be able to afford to give their kids piano lessons, art camp, and those sorts of things. So anything that I teach, I can figure out, how do I incorporate arts into that? Have and communicate high expectations. Sometimes I hear conversations about expectations, and I think that sounds a little fluffy and all that. But actually, there's a lot of research that shows that this is real and that the most important way to demonstrate high expectations is pedagogically. So the problem is we talk about high expectations, and then on average in this country, we give the wealthiest students access to the best pedagogies, the one that we know is the best, and then we give low-income kids most access to things like direct instruction, which we know is good to teach little skills here and there, but as an overall instructional model is the pits. It doesn't work. It doesn't engage kids. It's important for teaching specific skills, but as an overall instructional model, it is ineffective, and we know that it's ineffective from decades of research. But for some reason, people think this is where the bias comes in. Those kids can't handle anything more sophisticated. Right? So we have to shift our thinking about that. Collaborative, cooperative, this is the kind of pedagogy that's good for all students, but research shows that it's even most important for low-income students. Incorporating movement and exercise. Again, low-income kids are more likely to be taking care of siblings after school. Those sorts of things have less access to things like fields and stuff to play on, less likely to be able to afford to be able to participate in those sorts of things. So we can incorporate movement. I give in the book some examples of people in a physics class who incorporated movement. So in every subject area, we can think about how to do that. Again, it's most important for the lowest income students. Analyzing learning materials for bias. I think there was this time in the 80s and 90s where people were really focused on that around gender stuff, although we haven't completely taken care of that. Maybe in the 90s, people became more focused on that around race. We also have to think about it around class. Step number one is to take the frickin' hobo off your vocabulary wall. I can't believe I still walk into schools. Think of the picture of the hobo when you were a student. I walked into a school last week. That same picture of a hobo was on someone's vocab wall. And I'm thinking, what's dangerous about that is for some of the kids, that's the only thing about poverty they learn in school. The hobo. Like, can we be a little more sophisticated than the hobo? That's your task, if nothing else. Try to get beyond the hobo. Promote literacy enjoyment. Literacy tends to be taught in higher wealth schools in ways that engage students more, are more enjoyable. It tends to be taught in low-income schools in ways that are more rote, less enjoyable. These are some of the strategies that the research has identified that have worked, using popular culture, that sort of thing. Again, those are the things that tend to already be happening in wealthier schools as well. In the book, I list about 12 different strategies. This is like a little sampling of them. I think of beyond instruction. If you're at a school and they're thinking about taking away PE or recess, working to defend that. Also the arts, pushing back against high-stakes testing. I mean, this is the thing. Parents and teachers have been pitted against each other so much that we don't realize nobody wants high-stakes testing. Nobody wants that to be the center of assessment in our schools. Well, I think Pearson as a corporation is fairly excited about that. But nobody else, parents don't want it because they see how it affects kids. Teachers don't want it because of the stress it creates for them and their students. If the parents and teachers ever developed any kind of camaraderie over that, ever organized around that, we could make some real difference in the school. But if your attitude, if low-income parents know that your attitude is, y'all don't care about education, if they think you have a deficit view, they have no reason to want to support you. They have no reason to want to create those partnerships with you. You can see these other things that we can do. Analyze school policy and practice. I really believe that no program at a public school should cost extra money for somebody to participate. Nothing should cost extra money because you're immediately alienating, making sure some kids don't have access. Those sorts of things. Look at how that plays out in your school. Relational commitments, engage in persistent family outreach. Remember, again, low-income families are the ones who are most likely to have experienced school as a hostile environment, right? So we have to recultivate. We have to make up for other things that they've experienced. So being willing to do that. Making opportunities for family engagement accessible to low-income families, right? Again, for families who don't have access to childcare, who don't have access to transportation, right? Understand why, interpret why some of those gaps exist. As kind of a final reflection, again, I did just sort of touch on practical stuff, but I think this is the key point here. Our attitudes about poor families drive everything else. It's the most critical single thing about this. Right? So if nothing else, I want to challenge you to work on those stereotypes of bias, to take on your colleagues. If you're teacher educators, the teacher educators in here, you also have to think about how are we preparing teachers around this? If we're preparing them with the culture of poverty model that leads them into that deficit theory, we have to shift that practice. In fact, if any of our teaching around diversity and equity is about let's learn a little bit about Latino people, a little bit about African American people, that does not get us closer to equity. Learning about racial inequity, that gets us closer to equity. Learning about the inequity that low-income people face, that gets us closer to equity. Another sort of final reflection, again, this is about the congruence that you all heard about earlier. I was watching the Louis C.K. show. I'm not quite sure why. Anyone here know Louis C.K., the comedian? Once in a while, he busts out with this incredible social commentary. You're like, where did that come from? But in a show that I was watching just a couple days ago, this is what he said. He said, Americans only buy things that come from suffering. Now, think about the congruence there. Think about the congruence there. Now, how many of us, if you were in your school, if you were somewhere, anywhere, and heard somebody make a racist comment, how many of you would intervene? How many of you would say something about that? Intervene. How many of you, when you go into a department store to buy a shirt, ask yourself, I wonder what poor people, probably poor people of color, were brutalized so that I can buy this inexpensive shirt? A few of us, right? That's what Louis K. is talking about there. The reason this sort of culture of consumerism, the shirt we wear, the food we eat. So I read a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh, and one of the things that he talks about is mindfulness. And he talks about mindful eating, and he says, when you look at your food before you start eating, learn to see the whole universe in that food. Learn to see the good things. Learn to see the sun and the soil and the seeds. That's all in the food. And then, but also learn to see the suffering in your food. Who picked that tomato under what conditions? What animals were treated in awful ways at a factory farm so I can eat that cheap cheeseburger? To see the good, but also to see the suffering. And I think that's a really good sort of framework for thinking about working with students who come from marginalized families. I want to be able to see the structures of good. I want to be able to see their strengths that they bring with them. I also want to see the ways that the systems that I participate in have a role in their suffering. Have a role in their suffering. And it's every system in which we participate. So I'm going to leave it there. I don't know if we're over time or if we have time for questions or what's going on.
We have time for questions.
Okay. Yeah, so here's I also just want to give you my contact info in case you want. If you want resources that are about a specific grade level or subject area, and you email me, I'm very happy to send that to you. If you want to yell at me for some reason, just hit caps lock and then email me at that email address and I'll get the picture. Or you could just yell at me after I'm done here.